tu Agata, dzisiaj niezupełnie z końca świata. Akurat nadaję z Polski, wróciłam do kraju, mam nadzieję, że tylko na jakiś czas i przybywam z trzecią częścią mojego cyklu o Jordanii, a ściślej o Beduinach z Petry. Jest również ostatnia część mojej rozmowy z Krystyną. Do tej pory Krystyna opowiedziała nam o swojej historii, o tym, jak zaczęło się jej życie w beduińskiej wiosce, o swoich spostrzeżeniach dotyczących kodu kulturowego, w którym się znalazła, a jest on trochę inny niż ten, powiedzmy, jordański, niż ten taki oficjalny. I porozmawialiśmy też o oskarżeniach, z jakimi zmagają się Beduini, a także o ich stosunkach z władzami, z resztą kraju tak naprawdę, z innymi Beduinami również. Dzisiaj nadal rozmawiamy oczywiście o Beduinach. Rozwijamy temat beduińskiego stylu życia, przywiązania Beduinów do tradycji, a także konsekwencje, jakie się z tym wiążą. Ja ze swojej strony chciałabym zamknąć ten cykl, umieszczając to, o czym do tej pory rozmawiałyśmy, w nieco szerszym kontekście, a zatem chciałabym przybliżyć obraz Jordanii jako kraju, problemów, z jakimi się zmaga, historii, demografii. Także zapraszam.
We have to talk about the Bedouin lifestyle because it's completely different than Jordanian lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
Time.
Oh my god. Okay, let's say that Bedouins, I never met a Swiss Bedouin, like, no. They have this, what they call it, like the Bedouin time or the desert time, like, yeah, they are not very punctual and they say like, at all? Okay, let's say at all. So they are just chill out all the time, they take their time, they don't look at
Not at all.
Yeah, and so they will say, I'm coming, or I will be there, and you're expecting like kind of, I don't know, half an hour or whatever.
Reasonable time frame.
Yeah, reasonable time. And maybe 2-3 hours after, and you ask yourself, but he said he was coming. Something happened, like
Yeah, that's natural.
and then
reaction.
they come and everything normal, like they don't feel like
They're like, oh, haha, you know.
yeah, they are not late. They are, yeah, they come when they come. That's it. That's for them. It's completely normal.
Like, you know, the stories you told me about your husband.
Yeah, it's not
So-
natural. Yeah.
So basically, when you call him and you were asking him if he's coming home,
Yeah,
happens?
I'm coming home. And maybe, yes, of course, he comes home, but
in the general direction of home.
yeah, in the general action and pop up at home like, I don't know, could be midnight, 12 the night,
In 2 days sometimes.
or in 2 days, I never know. But he didn't lie, eh? He said he come home and in the end he come. But yeah, I mean, if you want to wait for a Bedouin, nah, forget. You're
No.
wasting your time. I mean, do your stuff.
Yeah.
And
He will show up when the time comes. Because the best plan is no plan. No plan.
yeah, no plan. That's what they always say. No plan. Like everything could change. I could change my mind and no plan. Because I think also they don't like to feel kind of to feel in a cage. Like I have the time. I have to be there. Like to be forced in a way. You know. They like to feel themselves like free. Maybe yeah, I want to go, but in 2 minutes maybe I change mind and I don't go.
Sitting in this cave yesterday, just a bunch of people came in. We were a bit like tired. We wanted to go to sleep. And also I wanted to talk, but anyway, it's not comfortable with some bunch of strangers, right?
Yeah, of course. Maybe you want to talk like, I don't know, face to face or whatever.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to find time
Yeah.
around here to have like face-to-face time without anyone. Like the fact that we are here alone,
Yeah.
I think we should all open champagne because it doesn't happen around here.
Very strange. Nobody pop up in the house. Like what?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here, one of the, I would say, one of the most difficult thing here is the lack of privacy. Like sometimes, of course, it's nice to be all together and everything, but sometimes you want your space, your time, your privacy, maybe with your husband or whatever. No, people just come in their house. I mean, here they don't call or they don't have appointment. People go and come like random. And it's completely acceptable for them, completely normal. But sometimes, as a European, you will feel like it's okay, but can please, I don't know, can I have now my time in my house? Like, I'm not in the street, my house, my privacy, or whatever. And you cannot even say this because you are very rude. In their culture, this is
Yeah, you can't kick
unpolite.
anybody out. No.
It's very unpolite. I mean, you have to welcome everybody because this is life. Go and come back, go and come back. Stay always all together. It's, for what you need privacy, what you have to talk about so important. You can talk
Yes.
before going to sleep. It's okay. It's not you need like time face to face, or they have a different perspective, about.
Yeah, and they just even if they don't say anything, they just sit, they look at their fingers, or
Yes.
have a smoke, have a
That's
tea.
the weird thing because okay, we are all together because we are all together. We
For some
we
reason.
eat,
Yes.
yeah. So we do something together. We speak, we eat, whatever. But if we are all in the same room or same cave or whatever, and everybody on his phone, why? You can be on your phone at your home, and maybe I want to stay by myself, So this is sometimes for me it's like I get really like
Yeah, overwhelmed
over
by
it.
that.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I have to say when I see what how it all works around here, I'm also. I mean, it is nice, but only for limited amount of time.
Yeah, not
Of course,
always.
not always, not always, yeah. And also when you walk the street, it's the same. You stop by every 5 meters, or less than 5 meters, because there is someone I mean, your friend knows on the street, right?
Yeah.
You can't just walk from point A to point B, no.
No, it's too simple. This. No, it doesn't work like this.
The families are really strong together, and that everything has to stay in family.
Mm.
So there are some issues with domestic violence going on.
Yeah, for what I know, there is. And even, okay, they say, yeah, it's not good to do this, but it's not like perceived like it's a criminal thing.
So let's say law probably says you are not supposed to beat your wife or whatever, but who is going to really come to help you? And I mean, maybe they would even come, but somebody will need to call, and you will not call because this is family and everything has to stay in family,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, here it's like this. It's you don't have to talk about your family issues with other people. Everything it's inside the wall of the house. It's like they have a strange idea of privacy. Kind of for them this is privacy, but not if I want to stay, for example, with my husband alone. It's, this is not not normal. So when I say that here, sometimes you feel like they think and they behave like upside down, because yes, they have this kind of idea of privacy, but they don't have the other part of privacy.
Jordania jest uznawana za jeden z najlepiej rozwiniętych krajów Bliskiego Wschodu. Ponad 98% ludzi powyżej 15 roku życia potrafi czytać i pisać. Jeśli zawężymy tę kategorię tylko do zakresu 15-24 lata, jest to nawet 99%. Jest to jeden z najlepszych wyników w całym regionie Środkowego Wschodu i Północnej Afryki, gdzie lepsze wyniki osiąga jedynie Arabia Saudyjska i Izrael. W samej Polsce mamy odsetek 98,7%, więc bardzo podobny. Do tego edukacja jest darmowa i zagwarantowana konstytucyjnie oraz obowiązkowa aż do 15 roku życia, więc znowuż podobnie jak w Polsce. Zarazem UNICEF wskazuje, że 70% trzecioklasistów nie potrafi czytać ze zrozumieniem. Tak więc można trochę podawać w wątpliwość to, na ile te statystyki faktycznie oddają jakość kształcenia. Tym niemniej krok w przód, jaki zrobiła Jordania w porównaniu do lat 60., kiedy poziom piśmiennictwa wynosił 33%, musimy przyznać, że jest olbrzymi.
I also read some articles that it is also a thing that many children are, for example, pushed to to start working instead of going to school.
Yeah.
Which also brings a question: isn't school mandatory around here? At least to certain.
Well, officially yes, it's mandatory, but okay, all this speech is about Bedouin culture, Bedouin
Yes.
village, not Jordan.
Yes.
So here, of course, it's mandatory also for Bedouins, But what it happens in their point of view, in their mindset, it's okay, or maybe it's even better that if you go as a child to work instead of going to the school. Because here they think about the family, about the children, as somebody that will help you,
Yeah.
even if there's just children. So let's say that now this trend is getting like abandoned, likely. But the past generations, it was like completely normal, and even if the families they didn't push the children to go to work, anyway they didn't control them. So if they, instead of going to school, they go to Petra, for example, to work with tourists, it's kind of maybe they don't even know that day the child went to
Yeah.
Petra. In Italy, I mean, this is completely no.
So social services would just come up because they would
Yes.
see that there is no child at school. Same in Poland, of course.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, they will just take your children and say, okay, you are not able to parenting, like, so we have to take your children because we will take care of them. But here there's not much control, you know.
Yeah.
I feel like somehow they don't even care because, for example, in Petra, I mean, the archaeological site,
Mm-hmm.
it's full of policemen, you know. But if they see like children working by donkeys and it's the day they should be at school, they don't report it. Because I think kind of the government is not really interested in this. Those policemen, they are there just to, let's say, to take care of the tourist. I mean, they are there for the tourist,
Mm-hmm.
not for, in general.
You mean that if something happens to, I don't know, I noticed that somebody took my phone, or I don't know, somebody harasses me, you know, trying to push me into, I don't know, going to donkey, yeah,
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah, I mean...
Tourist police almost.
Yeah,
Mhm.
tourist police, for them it's not a problem if they see like the children, they're supposed to go to school, to be in the school, not be in the school and working basically in front of their eyes. They do nothing because that's not the purpose they are there. They are
Yeah.
there to make sure that all the tourists are happy, no problem with tourists. So this will not happen like in Europe because of course every policeman will
Notice the teenager, or like, sometimes they are early teenagers, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and so they will report it, of course.
Yeah.
But here I feel like they don't care pretty much. So this was like a kind of normal situation in the past. Now we still have kind of this problem, but let's say that's getting better at least. And even the families, they understand now that it's better, or I don't know, at least they have to. It's fair to send their children to school, not to Petra to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially, you know, if you think about it, we already know a couple of people around here who can't read or write. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult to understand in 21st century, but even if you understand it, you do come to the conclusion that these people miss out on a lot.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, they lost opportunities in life
Yeah, exactly.
because, yeah, you don't want to study further, it's okay, but at least the basis you need it.
Yeah.
If you don't have the basis, you know, what kind of life can you have? I mean, I'm not saying that they live bad life, but if you don't study, it's easier to, I don't know, to scam you, for example.
Yes.
You cannot even read and write. How can you defend yourself? I
How
mean,
can you read some contract that you're signing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, yeah.
So, I mean, in the end, you lose like some, like let's say, defenses on
Yeah.
your side, some opportunities, of course. So, yeah, there are some people they cannot read and write, or they cannot read and write properly, at least. So,
Yeah. Like,
yeah.
if you think about it, that writing and reading properly also can be problem in Europe.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
So many
nowadays,
people, yes.
nowadays, I mean,
People,
of
people
course.
can't comprehend some, I don't know, instruction of, you know, how to operate microwave, right?
Yes. So this is
Yeah,
I
global
mean,
trend.
Yeah, I was the first time I knew this. I was surprised because even my grandparents they could read and write, and they were like poor and peasants, you know, like working since they were children, but at least read and write, not
Yeah.
like super cultural or
Yeah, these are such a basic skills that really can get you far in life if you just have some intelligence, you know. And we also know around here people who are intelligent. They are clearly intelligent.
they are super clever and they're very
Yes.
smart.
Yeah.
I mean, but the society didn't let them to be more on the next level, you know.
Yeah.
Jeśli spojrzymy tak powierzchownie na statystyki Banku Światowego, Jordania plasuje się w kategorii krajów wyższej klasy średniej pod względem dochodowym. No więc brzmi to całkiem dobrze. Jeśli natomiast zagłębimy się w szczegóły, realia okazują się trochę mniej różowe. Bowiem gospodarka Jordanii jest relatywnie mała, bardzo mała. Nie posiada ona żadnych surowców, w przeciwieństwie do praktycznie wszystkich sąsiadów bogatych w złoża ropy. Występuje tam również duży problem z zasobami wody, z dostępem do odnawialnych zasobów wody. Problem z zasobami wody w Jordanii jest tak duży, że plasuje się ona na drugim miejscu w skali świata, jeśli chodzi o właśnie możliwe zakłócenia w dostępie do wody. Mimo to w 2015 roku rząd ogłosił, że zapewniono już powszechny, ciągły dostęp do wody praktycznie wszystkim obywatelom bez względu na miejsce zamieszkania. Tutaj poczynię taką dygresję, bo nie wiem, czy system, który na przykład funkcjonuje właśnie w Sejhun, w beduńskiej wiosce, zalicza się do tego powszechnego, ciągłego dostępu. Tam bowiem, jeśli potrzebujemy wody, musimy ją po prostu zamówić i przyjeżdża sobie jakaś tam ciężarówka czy mini ciężarówka i dostarcza taki kontener, który jest umieszczany na dachu. Taki kontener nam mieszkającym tam, pomieszkującym tam w 4 osoby starczył na mniej więcej tydzień średnio, czasem mniej, czasem więcej. I mówimy właśnie o 4 osobach, które się myją, piorą ubrania, gotują itd. A zwykle w takim domostwie jest osób 14. I kiedy woda się skończyła, nie było nawet czym spuścić wody w ubikacji, już pomijając, nie wiem, zrobienie herbaty czy czegokolwiek. To nie jest tak, że, nie wiem, zamawiamy sobie jak w Uber Eats w aplikacji i 5 minut i mamy wodę. Nie. Tam czasem czekaliśmy na wodę przez dni. Więc na przykład przez 3 dni woda w ubikacji nie była spuszczana, tak mówiąc dosyć obrazowo. I to nie jest wyolbrzymienie. Tak więc to naprawdę stanowi duży problem. No, dostęp do wody jest ona dostarczana, ale nie można na pewno powiedzieć, że jest on ciągły. Ponadto przez to, że ta woda właśnie stoi w tym kontenerze, bardzo mocno odradza się jej picie, tak przynajmniej bez przygotowania. I ogólnie można w sumie zadawać sobie pytanie, jakie bakterie się w takiej wodzie namnażają w czasie, kiedy ona sobie tam stoi na tym słońcu. Także, no mówię, nie wiem, na ile ten system można uznać za część tego systemu, o którym chwalił się rząd w 2015 roku. Jordania zmaga się również z ryzykiem braku dostępu do pożywienia. Jest to związane zarówno z dosyć małym areałem ziemi uprawnej, jak i jest to pokłosie wspomnianych przed chwilą problemów z dostępem do wody. Konflikty o zasoby wody już mają miejsce. Jeszcze w 1959 zaczął się konflikt pomiędzy Egiptem i Etiopią. Egipt zarzuca Etiopii, że powoduje ona obniżenie wód Nilu, a jest to duży problem dla kraju.
Here I think there is some tendency to not really look for your own path, but rather like follow the path that was in place for generations.
yeah,
right?
like that's the culture, that's the tradition. Like every time you try to speak to them, like by the way, it's like this, I don't understand. I mean, for sure there is a reason, so tell me the reason. They don't even try to explain you the reason behind some behaviors. They just say, oh, but it's the culture, like it's normal. It always be like this, kind of, they don't think there is another way of life, you know?
Yeah.
This is the culture or the tradition is the justification for almost everything. So yeah, one time I get like very surprised when maybe we talk about it when I knew that here the women to get married they need kind of approval from the family. But when I say family, I don't say just the parents. I mean the parents, they are the first step. After the parents, like brothers. After the brothers, cousins.
Yeah, you witnessed it, right?
Yeah, I mean, if a man asks to a girl to marry her. Of course, first he goes to the parents, and if the parents agree, so next step. So now we ask if others of the family agree, and if one say no, I don't like this marriage, I don't approve, you don't get married. So I mean, and when I asked, like, but this is crazy, come on, I mean, I can understand the parents' approval, you know, okay, somehow,
But cousins?
cousins, and you know, here they don't have 1-2 cousins, it's like,
One guy has over 100 cousins
oh
to
my
give
God,
some.
village basically.
Yes, yes. There are some nephews he has that are older than him, as far as I remember, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say that the closest cousin,
Yes.
not all the village, yeah. But still, the closest cousin here can be even, I don't know, 20, because the family are so big. So, and when I ask, but come on, but no, why? I mean, why she cannot decide the man she wants to get married with? And the answer, once again, was like, yeah, but that's the culture. At that point, sometimes I ask back, like, okay, that's the culture, but you think this is good thing of your culture? Ah, that's the culture.
Mm.
Maybe they even say, okay, no, I don't think it's okay, but like kind of, what can I do? It's the culture. You have to accept it. It's kind of, fatalism in somehow.
Yeah, very much so.
Udział kobiet w jordańskim rynku pracy jest najniższy na całym świecie. Bezrobocie wśród najmłodszych ludzi, czyli do 30 roku życia, jest jednym z najwyższych. A mówimy tutaj o populacji, gdzie około 63% całego kraju to ludzie do 30 roku życia. Jest to bardzo młoda populacja. W ramach tej grupy występuje 3 razy tyle bezrobotnych kobiet co mężczyzn. Nie sposób również nie zauważyć trudnego sąsiedztwa, trudnej sytuacji geopolitycznej, w jakiej Jordania się znajduje. Na północy bowiem graniczy z Syrią, na północnym wschodzie z Irakiem, na wschodzie z Arabią Saudyjską, która, jak wiemy, w tym momencie jest w trakcie wojny z Jemenem, który sama zaatakowała. No i na zachodzie mamy Izrael i Palestynę. W trakcie kryzysu uchodźczego Jordania przyjęła 670 000 syryjskich uchodźców. Wiem, że nie wydaje się to być jakąś wielką liczbą, natomiast w ujęciu per capita, zważywszy, że Jordania jest dosyć małym krajem, jest to drugi najwyższy wynik na świecie. Więcej uchodźców właśnie w ujęciu per capita przyjął tylko Liban. Ten kryzys zrodził kolejne problemy. Już na tamtym etapie gospodarka Jordanii mocno zwolniła. Wzrost gospodarczy plasował się jedynie na poziomie 2%, co nie zapewniło nowych miejsc pracy dla tego całego napływu ludności. O Jordanii mówi się, że to najspokojniejszy kraj Bliskiego Wschodu. No i faktycznie w tym całym bliskowschodnim kotle jest to taka oaza spokoju. No w 2011 roku, podczas tzw. arabskiej wiosny, w Jordanii nie doszło do żadnej wojny domowej, ani do bardzo krwawo tłumionych protestów. Wydaje mi się, że to, jaki przebieg arabska wiosna tam miała, w dużej mierze osadzone było niejako w napięciach, jakie występują pomiędzy Jordanią a Palestyńczykami. Należy bowiem zaznaczyć, że Jordania tak naprawdę zajęła terytorium Palestyny w trakcie wojny arabsko-izraelskiej w 1948 roku, w każdym razie tzw. zachodni brzeg, West Bank. Nie spodobało się to zresztą pozostałym krajom arabskim zaangażowanym w tę wojnę i Jordania tak naprawdę została wtedy wykopana z całego sojuszu. Tym niemniej utrzymała to terytorium aż do 1967 roku, kiedy to utraciła je w trakcie wojny sześciodniowej. Nawet po utracie tego terytorium Palestyńczycy utrzymali jordańskie obywatelstwo, a nawet reprezentację w parlamencie. Nawet teraz szacuje się, że około 2-3 miliony ludzi w Jordanii to osoby pochodzenia palestyńskiego. No i można się spodziewać, oni się też zmieszali z lokalną ludnością. Jordania odpuściła roszczenia wobec terytoriów palestyńskich dopiero w 1988 roku. No i wracając do arabskiej wiosny, która jest trochę bliżej naszych współczesnych czasów, bo jak mówiłam, był to rok 2011, to było za mojego życia i prawdopodobnie za waszego również. Tak naprawdę punktem zapalnym arabskiej wiosny w Jordanii był wynik wyborów z października 2010 roku. Środowiska palestyńskie wysuwały przeciwko nim oskarżenia związane z niesprawiedliwością głosowania. Mianowicie zarzucali całemu systemowi wyborczemu, że bardzo faworyzuje on Beduinów, rdzenną ludność Jordanii. Należy bowiem podkreślić, że Beduini są lojalistami, popierają króla. Upatruje się w tym zresztą jedną z przyczyn tak dużej stabilizacji politycznej kraju. Na moim anegdotycznym wprawdzie przykładzie mogę powiedzieć, że wszyscy Beduini, z którymi rozmowy zeszły na tematy polityczne, wyrażali sympatię wobec króla, wobec monarchii. Natomiast wszyscy Jordańczycy, czyli osoby, które spotykałam w miastach, podkreślały nepotyzm oraz korupcję. Faktycznie oskarżenia niebeduinów wobec wyniku wyborów z 2010 roku były uzasadnione. System alokacji głosów, przypisanie ich do poszczególnych regionów był bardzo niesprawiedliwy i bardzo faworyzował właśnie beduińskie, wiejskie obszary. Aby zobrazować skalę problemu, w Amanie, stolicy, zamieszkanej w zdecydowanej większości przez ludność niebeduińską, jeden reprezentant przypadał na 95 000 głosów. Natomiast w beduińskich, wiejskich obszarach wahało się to pomiędzy 20 a 30 tysięcy osób głosów na jednego reprezentanta, więc można sobie wyobrazić, jak duża dysproporcja to była. Rozpoczętą już w styczniu 2011 roku falę protestów ówczesny, tak naprawdę świeżo wybrany premier przypłacił stanowiskiem, zaś król Abdallah przeprowadził szereg reform. Reformy te można by nazwać dosyć powierzchownymi w stosunku do tego, czego żądali protestujący. Przykładowo zniesiono prerogatywę monarchy do bezterminowego przedłużania kadencji parlamentu. Ograniczono też swobodę rządu w wydawaniu tymczasowych aktów prawnych pod nieobecność parlamentu. I protesty nadal trwały, odbywały się każdy piątek aż do 2014 roku. Tymczasem 4 rządy później, w 2012 roku, król Abdullah rozwiązał kolejny rząd, a także parlament i ogłoszone zostały nowe wybory. W tamtym okresie również uchwalono nową ordynację wyborczą. Problem w tym, że ordynacja ta, co wskazywane było nie tylko przez opozycjonistów, ale też przez międzynarodowych obserwatorów, była jedynie kosmetyczna, nie naprawiała problemów systemowych. Nadal była ta dysproporcja pomiędzy obszarami wiejskimi i miejskimi, jeśli chodzi o alokację głosów. I tak też część środowisk opozycyjnych w ogóle zbojkotowała te wybory. Podobnie jak zresztą wybory 2010 roku. No i mamy 2013 rok. 2 lata po wybuchu pierwszej fali protestów. 5 gabinetów, 5 premierów później. Nadal mamy niedemokratyczny system wyborczy, faworyzujący regiony zamieszkane przez ludność rdzenną i nie zapewniający wszystkim obywatelom proporcjonalnego, równego udziału w rządzeniu poprzez zapewnienie im proporcjonalnej reprezentacji. Gospodarka nadal kuleje, wzrost gospodarczy nadal jest na bardzo niskim poziomie. No i wracamy do punktu wyjścia. Wybrany zostaje ponownie lojalistyczny parlament, a z niego uformowany lojalistyczny rząd. Cały ten kryzys, wojna w Syrii niejako otworzyły oczy Jordańczykom, do tamtej pory walczącym o demokratyzację kraju, o reformy gospodarcze, że jeśli doprowadzą do eskalacji konfliktu pomiędzy nimi a władzami, sytuacja może rozwinąć się w ten sam sposób jak w Syrii i doprowadzić do po prostu wojny domowej, a następnie obcej ingerencji. Tak też wojna w Syrii walnie przyczyniła się do tego, że protesty w Jordanii umarły śmiercią naturalną niejako. Zaczęły po prostu stopniowo przycichać.
Yeah, actually I feel, yes, I feel comfortable also outside, but yeah, you have to avoid some behavior, some things, some topics even. But at home, at least you're at home.
You can be yourself.
Yeah.
And which topics other than family you should avoid when you are outside?
Topics. Let's say that this is like a big cultural issue. For example, you don't put in doubt like religion or let's say their prophet, you know. Like you remember the big problem we had in Europe, I mean especially France and once I think Denmark, because they draw like comics or something like this with the prophet and this. And all the Muslim world like get scandaled and like, wow, you are completely like crazy, you cannot do this, this is a lack of respect for our prophet and this. And here is a massive different point of view that they cannot understand at all. I mean, when I try to explain them the European point of view, they really like, you find a wall, blind. When you try to explain them the history, because there's a history behind of, how do you call it in English? The satire?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that there is some plot to that, or like
Yeah, and this is,
and punchline.
and when I told them, yeah, but this is, I understand that you don't like maybe that the topic, but for us it's not a lack of respect. We make a joke of everything. We make joke of Jesus Christ. You know how many like stuff we have on Facebook or whatever, because it's not we don't respect Jesus Christ or what. It's just, I don't know, to have fun. It's like another point of view. It's like more easygoing. It's like more, and still we have big tradition of satire, and it comes from ancient Greek
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
And this is completely in our tradition. It's like a kind of, I say, not literature, but like genre, you know? It's,
Yeah, I mean, it was form of art.
yes, it's a form of art. But if you say this to them, it's like, what? They get like almost aggressive. Form of art that your lack of respect in front of the prophet. This is you call art?
Okay.
It's impossible to make them understand this is completely okay for us. This is completely okay topic. Because we even do it with our religion.
Yeah.
And the Catholic people, they don't get offended. It's just our way of thinking, our mindset.
Yeah.
So this kind of topics, it's like a taboo. You cannot explain them or make like a joke, you know, like about something. Like, no, okay, if you know some jokes about the prophet or whatever, keep it for yourself, because they will not appreciate it at all. So this is like very strong. I mean, you really find a wall when you want to talk about this. So this is not a topic here, like let's say a loud topic, like completely haram, how they say, like
Yeah.
completely bad. And they say, we don't speak bad about Jesus like this. So why you do it with our prophet or with our religion on this? And well, first of all, I always answer them that Jesus also is a prophet for you, because you recognize it as a prophet. So, but I try to make them understand that okay, you don't speak, you don't make joke about Jesus Christ, but we do. We are Christian, we do. So it's not a lack of respect in front of your, I mean, towards your
Yeah.
religion. It's just our way of being.
Yes.
It's just normal. Just we call it satire. It's satire. Okay, you will not appreciate it, but it's not a lack of respect.
Yeah, and also that's interesting, you know, with this, because I haven't seen anybody here like praying, what is it, 5 times a day?
Yeah,
I
it's supposed to be like this.
Yeah, exactly. I don't really see that around here.
Maybe not
I-
so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the street sometimes I see people like taxi driver or whatever, they put their carpet and they pray. Sometimes I see some Bedouins, there is a shop in front of the treasury, there is like a place near close to the treasury where they go to pray.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's not like all the people when there is like the praying
that.
time, they stop themselves. No.
Yeah, so it also shows that this is kind of like liberal. I mean, to an extent, of course, because
Yeah.
it's a bit of an oxymoron to talk about any Muslim country liberal. Still,
Yeah.
of course, we define liberalism probably differently
Yes.
than they do, but
Yes, it's yeah, completely different point of view. That's why I
Yes.
think sometimes we end up in so many misunderstandings, like this of the joke of the prophet or whatever.
yes,
It's still something that for us is completely okay, and they get like so badly offended. But it's just a point of view, like we don't
Yeah.
even think we are doing something bad, but they do. And on the opposite way, it's the same. Like for example, when the law here, they say that as a wife I have to obey my husband. For me, this is a lack of respect. Like, you think I'm stupid, I cannot decide by myself. But for them, it's like no, it's
normal.
It's normal.
That's how things should be.
Yeah.
And probably there is some passage in Quran that they could put, to justify it.
Yeah, there is, because the Surah number 4 they speak about women and they defined many of these things. And it says that the woman in general, the wife, must obey the husband. That's why they.
But in Catholic vows, during the ceremony of the marriage ceremony, there used to be also a line where a woman was declaring, right, that she will obey her husband.
Yeah, but this is the point. I mean, it's not about because if I have to speak honestly, I would say we are Muslim, we are not Christian, because we forgot long time ago the Bible and this kind of stuff.
Yes,
now
that's
for
true.
us, Christianity is like celebrating Christmas and to stay together. It's not in Europe. Almost nobody nowadays follow the rules, because if you have to follow the rules like Catholic or in general Christianity rules, you will be in the same situation of them. This is not allowed, not allowed, not allowed, nothing allowed.
Exactly, everything is a sin, everything.
Yeah, it's everything. So I mean, when I speak about this kind of topic, what I want to make it clear is not about, I don't know, Islam, it's something like this, and Christianity is something wow. They are the same. Because if you follow the rules of our religion, wow, you also cannot do anything. There's not equality between men and women. But what's the step? I think we made one step up. We keep the two things very separated. You can be Christian, but in your way. You can believe in God, but you don't have to pray all the day and do this or get offended for a joke or this. You have your way. It's completely private,
Yes.
It's like I like don't know, this color or the other one, but it doesn't make like the way of all of my life. But here they cannot separate the religion with the life, and sometimes also even with the laws. Another level. It's not like the Middle Age. You base all of your life in religion. That's the point. But they still pay too much attention to religion. That's the point.
Yeah, it's even demonstrated by the language, right? Inshallah,
yeah, it's
Wallah.
full of this. Yeah.
Everything with
it's
Allah.
about God.
Dotarliśmy do końca mojej rozmowy z Krystyną, opowieści o Sejhun, beduńskiej wiosce na obrzeżach Petry, a w kontekście dzisiejszego wydania mojej narracji o Jordanii w szerszym kontekście. Wszystkie źródła linkuję poniżej. Jeśli jeszcze tego nie zrobiliście, zachęcam do obczajenia pozostałych 2 odcinków tej serii.